Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a nursery where the wallpaper is peeling in the patterns of roses, and the air smells faintly of milk gone sour, coal smoke. You can almost hear the floorboards complaining beneath a nanny's boots as she paces, pacing the rhythm of a time when childhood itself was a kind of training camp for survival. You're about to see why Victorian parenting would be flat out illegal today. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes of it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing how far this sleepy little community stretches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in London, somewhere around 1875. The city is wrapped in fog so thick it tastes like iron. Horse hooves clap on cobblestones outside, and inside this cramped room, a baby wails in a wooden crib that looks more like a fruit crate with ambitions. The walls are thin enough for neighbors to hear the crying and to judge whether you're a good mother or not. Parenthood here isn't about bonding time or Montessori toys. It's about keeping that tiny heartbeat going another night in a world that doesn't have antibiotics, indoor plumbing, or TikTok parenting advice. The average working class mother might have 6 or 7 children, but she knows by cruel arithmetic that only 4, maybe 3, will live long enough to walk to school. Infant mortality is so normal, it is practically a footnote in family stories. We lost the little one after Christmas gets said with the same tone someone today might use to mention a flat tire. The nursery, if you can call it that, is dim. The cradle rocks not by gentle hand, but by a string tied to the mother's foot as she mends laundry. Babies are swaddled tight enough to resemble overstuffed loaves, a practice meant to keep them straight-limbed and calm, but often leaving them gasping for air. Some are spoon-fed thick gruel, laced with Godfrey-esque cordial, a sweet syrup cut with opium. Yes, opium. Victorian parents, bless them, thought it was a miracle sleep aid. You give it to the baby, and presto, instant peace. Modern child services would call it poisoning. Back then, it was sold right beside cough drops. Even the wealthier families weren't safe from absurdity. In the better neighborhoods, nurseries gleamed with mahogany and lace, and nannies, often Irish or Scottish girls barely out of their teens, managed the children while parents attended dinners or spiritual seances. The babies wore elaborate christening gowns that could trip an adult, and teething remedies sometimes included a little silver nitrate rubbed directly onto the gums. If you're wincing, imagine being the baby. One mainstream historical fact: between 1840 and 1900, roughly 1 in 5 British children didn't make it to their 5th birthday. The numbers were even worse. In industrial cities like Manchester, parents lived in a state of quiet fatalism, loving fiercely, but with the guarded heart of someone who knows nature might snatch that love away any night. A fringe tidbit: some families genuinely believed that spirits could reclaim the soul of a child who was too beautiful to stay. So, if your toddler fell sick, you might whisper that he was only on loan from the angels. There are letters, real ones, where mothers thank God for calling him home early. You can almost feel the heartbreak hiding under the theology. Historians still argue whether this high mortality made Victorians emotionally distant or, paradoxically, even more sentimental. Some claim the endless portraits of sleeping, angelic children, painted posthumously, showed grief turned into art. Others insist it was a kind of psychological armor. The more you risked losing, the more you pretended you were fine. You move deeper into the room. There's a Bible on the table, a hairbrush with a missing handle, and a framed photo taken by a traveling photographer. The baby in the image is eerily still because, well, he had to be. It's a memento mori, a photo taken after death. The parents might have saved up for weeks to afford that one image, posing their lifeless child as if asleep. The photographer worked quickly, and then the mother would press a lock of hair into a locket to wear forever. Imagine explaining that to a modern Instagram audience. Even the soundscape is strange to your ears. Lullabies with lyrics about heaven, whispered prayers, promising that good children don't fear the grave, and the steady hiss of the gas lamp that fills the room with warmth and danger in equal measure. If the baby didn't die of disease, there was always a chance of fire or smog inhalation. Parenting was an act of endurance, not optimization. You picture yourself there, your smartphone swapped for a kerosene lamp, your baby monitor replaced by instinct and superstition. You'd check the infant's breathing every few minutes, terrified of the smothering, a mysterious death, now recognized as ideas. Doctors might tell you to leave the window open for fresh air. Meanwhile, soot drifted in like black snow. Every advice column contradicted the last. The rich published moral essays about the proper Christian upbringing, lecturing the poor from their cushioned drawing rooms. Yet, those same authors often sent their own kids to boarding school by age 7, practically outsourcing affection. One diary entry from a London mother in 1881 reads, "He cries for me at night. The nurse says, I must not go, lest I make him weak." Can you imagine being told not to comfort your own child because love might spoil him? Victorian logic could be colder than the fog outside. Some nights, after the fires burned low, a mother might hold her baby and hum softly, half to soothe him and half to keep herself awake. The city outside thumped with cartwheels and muffled shouts. Rats scratched at the walls. Yet there was tenderness here too, the fragile tenderness of people doing their best in a brutal world. Parenting was love through exhaustion. You might think, surely it couldn't have been all bleak. And you'd be right. There were moments of laughter, toddlers chasing chickens in backyards, siblings playing with hoop and stick toys, fathers carving little wooden animals on Sundays. But those flashes glowed brighter precisely because the darkness around them was so deep. So, as you settle back into your pillow, let that sink in. If you were a Victorian parent, your biggest fear wouldn't be screen time or sugar. It would be waking to silence, the kind that means the crying has stopped for good. And yet, morning would still come, and you'd still have to get up, boil the water, and try again, because that's what love looked like then. Gritty, grieving, and unrelentingly human. Tomorrow, we'll follow that same child, if he survives, into a world where discipline is considered divine, and a beating is a bedtime story waiting to happen. But for now, just listen to the hush of the nursery, that uneven breath, that flicker of the lamp, and the way history hums beneath your skin. You wake to the same fog, thicker now, pressing against the windows like a damp wool blanket. The baby has grown a little, survived another round of coughs, maybe even cut a tooth. That alone feels like victory. But in Victorian Britain, survival is only the first test. The real shaping begins now. Discipline, morality, obedience. You're not just raising a child, you're constructing a citizen for the empire. And that means pain, patience, and more than a few well-aimed swats. A mainstream fact first. Victorian discipline was rooted in the Bible. Spare the rod and spoil the child. Almost every parent, from coal miner to countess, took that literally. Corporal punishment wasn't a dark family secret. It was public policy. Schools, homes, churches, all carried the same refrain. Suffering builds character. If your son misbehaves, you don't talk it out. You reach for the strap, the belt, the birch, the slipper, the cane. Each had its place. You might even hang the chosen implement in plain sight. A visual sermon about virtue. In wealthier homes, nannies kept punishment logs to report to mothers. Master Edward received 2 smacks for insolence before pudding. Imagine getting demerits with your dessert. Children weren't just corrected for breaking rules. They were shaped by them. Silence at the table, straight posture, perfect handwriting, all served as small rehearsals for future obedience. The idea was that a well-behaved child mirrored moral order itself. If you slouched, that meant something was wrong in your soul. But let's drop into a single room, shall we? You're watching a small boy, maybe 7, sitting on a hard wooden chair. He's been there an hour already, staring at the wallpaper pattern. Ivy climbing upward, mocking his stillness. His sin? He spilled ink on a copybook. The tutor stands behind him, polishing his spectacles, and mutters about careless hands. When the cane finally comes down, it's quick and precise, like punctuation. No one screams. You learn early that tears don't earn mercy. They earn more strikes. And yet, here comes your first gentle joke. Victorian parents still believed they were progressive because they used the soft end of the slipper on Sundays. Empathy, apparently, had a Sabbath discount, a fringe tidbit in certain elite circles. Some doctors and moralists preached that a properly administered beating could cure moral diseases, lying, laziness, even left-handedness. Yes, left-handedness. Manuals described it as a deformity of will. So, if your child reached for the spoon with the wrong hand, you might tie that arm behind their back for weeks. You'd call it love. They'd call it lunch with one arm. Now, historians still argue whether Victorian strictness truly produced the disciplined, efficient citizens it promised, or just generations of anxious adults with spectacular penmanship. Some claim it forged resilience in a hard world. Others see it as sanctioned cruelty wrapped in lace. The truth probably sits somewhere in between, drinking tepid tea and insisting it's fine. Let's look closer at gender. Boys were trained for public virtue, courage, stoicism, leadership. That meant boarding schools with mottos like endure and conquer. There, older students were deputized to punish younger ones. A system called fagging. Imagine an entire social pyramid of supervised bullying. Parents didn't just permit it, they paid for it. Girls, meanwhile, learned obedience of a quieter kind. They were warned that tempers and opinions made women ugly from within. A cross remark could earn a week of silent treatment or extra needlework. Mothers reminded daughters that a lady's tongue must never wag too freely. You might want to tell them about podcasts, but maybe not yet. And through all this, the Victorian household believed discipline was a love in disguise. Fathers often described themselves as moral gardeners, pruning bad habits before they took root. The phrase character building was born here, though sometimes it built only fear. One evening, you overhear a conversation between parents. The father, his voice clipped and righteous, says, "He must learn to obey now, lest the world teach him later." The mother nods, but stares at her folded hands. There's a tiny tremor there, the kind that never makes it into history books. Punishment wasn't random. It was ritualized. Some families made children kneel on dry peas, or stand for hours in corners labeled the penitent S-post. Others used cold baths at dawn as purification. And yet, after every punishment came reconciliation, a kiss on the forehead, a whispered prayer, the reassurance that it hurt the parent more than it hurt you, a statement modern therapists would have a field day with. Public schools took things even further. You might recognize names like Eton or Harrow, where future statesmen were broken in like horses. One contemporary headmaster proudly declared, "The boy must learn early that he belongs not to himself, but to duty." Translation: personal boundaries are for lesser mortals. Still, Victorians weren't entirely unfeeling. Discipline was supposed to balance justice and affection. Family letters often end with, "Your loving father, who only desires your goodness." Children sometimes wrote back, thanking their parents for correction, the way hostages thank negotiators. Even nursery rhymes reflected this moral obsession. Diddle diddle dumpling, my son John went to bed with his stockings on, sounds innocent, until you realize it was used to scold children for untidiness. Every song carried a moral, every bedtime story a warning. If Hansel and Gretel wandered off, it wasn't adventure, it was karmic punishment for disobedience. But the cracks begin to show. By the late 19th century, some reformers, early psychologists, mostly women, started asking whether constant fear really created virtue. Writers like Mrs. Panton and Harriet Martineau published essays arguing that affection should replace anger. One even suggested that a kiss could correct what the rod cannot. Radical stuff in a century where hugs were practically contraband. You think of today's parenting manuals, timeouts, positive reinforcement, gentle parenting. Imagine reading those aloud in 1880. The neighbors would call the doctor and the priest just to be safe. Still, somewhere in a terraced house in Birmingham, a mother hesitates before raising her hand. The coal fire throws orange light on the wall, and for a heartbeat, she sees her child's fear reflected there. She lowers her palm. Maybe she whispers an apology. Maybe not, but the pause is enough to plant a seed of change. Small, invisible, but growing. That's how revolutions begin. Not with declarations, but with mothers choosing silence over the slap. Outside, a factory whistle shrieks. It's dawn again. The same boy who spilled ink yesterday now buttons his threadbare jacket. He's not walking to school. He's going to work. The rod has done its job. He's obedient, punctual, and about to step into the next illegal, by modern standards, chapter of Victorian childhood. Labor. The streets smell of soot and wet hay. His breath clouds the air. as he joins a line of other children clutching lunch tins. The city swallows them all in one gray breath. You follow him, footsteps soft on the cobblestones, into the mechanical heart of empire, where discipline meets desperation, and where playtime costs a finger. The clang of the factory bell rings before sunrise, slicing through the fog like a judgment. You trail behind the same boy from the last section. His name could be Thomas, or Will, or anything really. There were millions just like him. His cap is too big, his boots too small, and his stomach rumbles with the kind of hunger that's more routine than pain. Victorian Britain calls this building character. You'd call it child labor. The street reeks of coal, and even before you step inside the mill, the air feels gritty, as if the whole city's lungs are wearing out together. Inside, the hum of machines is deafening, spinning frames, bobbins, gears, belts whipping past like angry snakes. The smell is part oil, part sweat, part something metallic and old. The child looks up, blinking through the haze, and you realize this is his world from now on, a mainstream historical fact. By 1835, nearly half of all textile workers in England were under 18, many under 12. The Factory Acts that eventually limited child labor existed mostly on paper. Inspectors were few, bribery was common, and the economic machine needed small, nimble hands. If you could fit between the looms or into a chimney, congratulations. You were hired. Parents didn't always resist this system. For many families, sending a child to work wasn't cruelty. It was necessity. A few extra pennies meant bread, rent, maybe a candle for the dark. Imagine explaining to a modern social worker that your 8-year-old S job keeps the family alive. It wasn't seen as exploitation so much as contribution. Victorian parenting ran on pragmatism, not sentiment. And the hours, 12, sometimes 14 a day. If the overseer was generous, you got a 20-minute meal break. Children nodded off, standing up, leaning against warm machines, until a sharp rap with a stick reminded them they were still employed. The noise never stopped. You could shout into your coworker's ear and still not be heard. You move through the rows. Tiny faces gray with lint. One girl ties her hair in a rag to keep it from catching in the gears. Another's cough rattles her chest like a paper bag. When she sneezes, dust rises, and you realize she's inhaled more cotton than air. Victorian doctors called it mill fever. You'd call it respiratory collapse. The fringe tidbit: in some towns, mill owners actually built children as dormitories on site so parents could drop off kids for the week, picking them up only on Sundays. The owners pitched it as efficiency. Less travel time, more moral supervision. Historians still debate whether that supervision meant protection or just better control. Out in the countryside, chimney sweeps recruited orphan boys from workhouses, paying masters a few shillings apiece. A sweep's apprentice would start as young as 6. They'd strip down, grease their bodies, and climb the narrow flues, scraping soot as they went. If they got stuck, and many did, someone would light straw at the bottom to encourage movement. You can guess how that ended. Modern safety codes would faint on sight. The boy you've been following, let S call him Thomas now, dreams not of escape, but of shoes without holes. He's not bitter. He doesn't yet know another life is possible. When his mother tucks him in at night, on the rare nights he's home, she whispers a prayer that God bless his work. That's love, Victorian style, faith in endurance. Historians still argue whether industrialization ultimately liberated children by drawing them into education later, or simply consumed their youth in service to profit. Some say the factory floor gave rise to empathy and reform. Others call it the graveyard of childhood. You can hear the debate in every clanking gear, every breath caught in the smog. But not all stories are bleak. Occasionally, an overseer would show a sliver of humanity. A biscuit slipped into a child's hand. A wink that said, "Rest a minute while the boss isn't looking." Small mercies mattered. There are accounts of mill girls forming secret choirs, humming hymns between shifts, their voices vibrating against the machines like rebellion dressed as rhythm. Your second light joke arrives. At least nobody back then had to worry about screen time. The only glow was from molten metal, and you definitely didn't want to stare at that for too long. Back in London, chimney sweeps weren't the only young laborers. There were street sellers hawking matches, mudlarks scouring riverbanks for scrap, and errand boys racing through traffic so chaotic it made modern rush hour look like a meditation retreat. Parents sometimes watched from windows, proud in a grim way. Their children were useful. Respectable families needed usefulness like oxygen. At the same time, moralists preached that idleness was the root of sin. If your child lounged too long, pamphlets warned, vice would find him. The phrase, "devil makes work for idle hands," wasn't a metaphor. It was a parenting manual. So children worked, and parents prayed, and nobody quite noticed that childhood itself was vanishing. Then reformers started whispering about change. Charles Dickens, with his sharp quill and sharper conscience, published Oliver Twist in 1837, and suddenly readers saw child labor as tragedy, not necessity. Public outrage followed, but slowly, Victorian outrage moved at the pace of treacle. Decades later, the 10 Hours Act tried to limit workdays for women and children. Employers protested, parents worried about lost wages, and inspectors carried clipboards that couldn't fix poverty. Yet progress came, grain by grain. Sunday schools appeared, giving working children a few hours of reading and rest. Activists like Lord Shaftesbury argued that childhood should belong to families, not factories. The movement grew, proof that even a world built on soot could dream of sunlight. You pass by a wall poster in 1880s London. Children are not tools of trade. The slogan is simple, the kind of truth everyone feels, but few admit. Still, the factories hum on, even with laws, enforcement lags, and parents keep sending their children because the stomach trumps the conscience every time. One evening, Thomas comes home early. His fingers are raw, his voice hoarse, but he smiles. He's been promoted to bobbin boy. It means 1 penny more per day. His mother hugs him like he's won a medal. Somewhere inside you, it aches, the way love adapts to scarcity. Victorian parenting, for all its flaws, wasn't devoid of affection. It just existed inside a system where survival came first. Every bruise, every missed meal, every long shift was rationalized. As preparation for adulthood, the world demanded toughness, and parents delivered. But tonight, as the lamps flicker, you sense the cracks in that armor. Parents whispering regrets, children dreaming of gentler days. The factory whistle blows again, echoing into the distance. You step outside, ears ringing, heart heavy. The fog swallows the street, and in it, you can almost hear the chorus of small, tired voices fading into sleep. Tomorrow, some of them will go to work again. Others won't wake up at all. And in the homes left behind, mothers will pray, fathers will tighten belts, and the myth will continue that hard work builds virtue, that obedience ensures safety, that suffering refines the soul. You already know how fragile those myths are, but for them, it was faith. Still, amid all this soot and sorrow, another world begins to stir, a world of reformers, quack doctors, and strange home remedies. Because if the Victorians were harsh disciplinarians, they were also world-class meddlers in medicines. You're about to meet the era's parenting toolkit: opium syrups, mercury lotions, and enough superstition to fill a pharmacy. You follow the smell before you see it, a sharp blend of camphor, vinegar, and something sweet that's trying very hard to hide the scent of rot. This is a Victorian medicine cabinet, and it's about to prove that sometimes love and danger come in the same bottle. Parenting here doesn't end at bedtime. It continues through coughs, fevers, and the terrifying silence of a child who stops breathing in the night. You might call the doctor, but back then, that wasn't always the safest decision. The wooden cabinet creaks open. Inside are bottles with friendly names: Godfrey's Cordial, Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, Dalby's Carminative. Each label promises relief, sleep, and peace for infants. What they don't mention is the key ingredient: opium. Sweet, floral, numbing opium. A few drops could calm a colicky baby. A few more could end a life. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, launched in the 1840s, contained morphine sulfate and alcohol and was marketed directly to mothers. Advertisements called it the mother's friend. It was sold in every corner, apothecary, often next to biscuits and boot polish. Parents didn't see it as risky. They saw it as mercy. In a world without antibiotics or painkillers, you took what comfort you could find, even if it came from a bottle of poison. Picture yourself at a kitchen table lit by a single oil lamp. Your baby has been screaming for hours. Your husband's at the factory, and you haven't slept since Monday. You reach for the cordial, not because you're cruel, but because you're human. You measure the drops carefully, 1, 2, 3, and within minutes, the baby's breathing slows, the crying fades, and you finally feel like you can breathe too. You don't know that those tiny doses are quietly building tolerance in your child's body, or that addiction can start before language does. And here's your fringe tidbit. Some Victorian doctors actually recommended small doses of arsenic to harden children against disease. They called it tonic dosing. Parents would dissolve minute amounts of arsenic in water, believing it gave a healthy pallor. You can almost hear the collective gasp of every modern pediatrician. Historians still argue whether Victorians truly trusted these remedies or simply had no alternatives. Was it faith in science or just desperation wrapped in Latin labels? Some scholars say the era's fascination with chemistry reflected genuine progress. After all, this was the age of discovery, when germs were finally being identified and anesthesia was revolutionizing surgery. Others insist it was a golden age of snake oil, where profit thrived on parental panic. But it wasn't all quackery. There were genuine attempts at care, too. Mothers made poultices of bread and milk for fevers, mixed honey with vinegar for sore throats, and used mustard plasters to draw out chest congestion. Some of it even worked, sort of. And when it didn't, at least it smelled nice. There's a sound, a faint rattle, from the child's chest. The local doctor arrives, top hat slightly crooked, hands already stained with nicotine and ink. He doesn't wash them. Germ theory is still new, and not everyone's on board with this invisible enemy idea. He prescribes laudanum, instructs the mother to keep the windows open for fresh air, and leaves before she can ask if the chill might make things worse. Spoiler, it will. You glance around the room. On the mantel sits a book titled Domestic Medicine, or The Family Physician. It is filled with advice, ranging from rub bacon fat on frostbite to feed your child porter for strength. Yes, beer. Dark, heavy, adult beer. The Victorians gave it to toddlers because it settled the humors. Somewhere, a modern nutritionist just fainted. Still, for all the absurdity, you can't entirely laugh. These people were groping toward modern medicine, fumbling in the dark with candles of half-truths. Every remedy was an act of hope. Parents wanted control in a world where disease struck without warning. Diphtheria, cholera, scarlet fever, names whispered like curses. Even a simple rash could turn deadly. At night, you can hear the city's coughs echoing through thin walls. Parents wrap children in flannel and whisper prayers against the night air. They blame miasma, bad smells, corrupted vapors for sickness. So they sprinkle vinegar, burn herbs, hang camphor balls on ribbons around necks. The air grows sharp and medicinal, like living inside a giant pickle jar. There's a curious little superstition. Some mothers swore that rubbing the soles of a sick child's feet with goose fat could draw the fever down. Others tied slices of onion to the baby's socks. Victorian parenting was part science experiment, part folk magic, and entirely fueled by exhaustion. By the 1870s, reformers began to notice the problem. Newspapers printed exposés about the baby killers, meaning patent medicine companies. The first attempts at regulation began, and eventually, the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act in the US and its British cousins forced manufacturers to list ingredients. But that came decades too late for countless children. You can't help but wonder how much of parenting, even now, is faith disguised as knowledge. We trade opium syrups for Wi-Fi baby monitors, arsenic tonics for immune-boosting gummies, and still, underneath, it's the same instinct to do something, anything, when our children hurt. A moment of levity. Victorian parents also swore by cod liver oil. Kids hated it, of course. Mothers called it liquid sunshine. Historians joke that the average child probably developed strong bones, purely from trying to flee the spoon. But beneath all the humor, there's tenderness. A mother presses her palm to her child's forehead, counting breaths in the dark. A father sits silently, rubbing his temples, pretending not to cry when the fever doesn't break. Medicine might fail them, but love doesn't. That's the contradiction at the heart of Victorian parenting. It could be misguided, even dangerous, yet still rooted in the deepest care. And then dawn arrives. The child stirs, weak but alive. The mother whispers, thanks to God, to the syrup, to luck. She doesn't know which one worked. Outside, the streets awaken with carts and crows and coughs. Somewhere in a better part of town, a doctor reads a new paper about germs, frowns, and mutters. Perhaps we've been killing them with kindness. The line between help and harm has never been thinner, and now As the morning light spills across that same nursery table, another question rises. If medicine and morality defined a good parent, what about education? What about shaping the mind? Because soon enough, your Victorian child will leave behind the syrup bottles and step into the echoing hall of a school, where discipline meets doctrine, and learning is just another form of obedience. The classroom smells like chalk, damp wool, and a faint undercurrent of boiled cabbage drifting from the caretaker's quarters. You step inside, behind the children, your Victorian child among them, and feel the weight of silence settle over the room like dust. This is the other battlefield of Victorian parenting. Education, not the bright, playful kind you might recognize, but an arena where obedience, morality, and social order were hammered into young minds, one slate at a time. Rows of desks stretch forward, each occupied by a small, stiff figure. Every child sits perfectly upright, hands folded, eyes fixed on the teacher's pointer stick. As it slices through the smoky air, the alphabet is printed above the blackboard. But so are verses from the Bible. Idle hands are the devil's tools. The lesson plan is simple. Read, recite, remember. Thinking for yourself is not part of the curriculum, a mainstream historical fact. Formal schooling became widespread in Britain after the 1870 Education Act, which made elementary education compulsory for children up to age 10. It was hailed as progress, a society finally recognizing that knowledge, not just labor, could shape its citizens. But progress came with a side of punishment. Teachers could and did beat students for mistakes, lateness, or even untidy handwriting. The cane wasn't just a threat, it was punctuation. You watch the teacher, a man with sideburns so precise they could slice paper, pacing the aisles. His shoes squeak. The children recite multiplication tables in a rhythm so steady it sounds like factory machinery. 6 times 8 is 48. 6 times 9 is 54. A child stumbles on a number. The pointer taps the desk sharply. No shouting needed. The sound itself carries centuries of authority. The chalk squeals. You flinch. The teacher doesn't. He's too focused on turning chaos into order. Every lesson doubles as moral instruction. Geography isn't just maps. It's proof of Britain's greatness. Science isn't about curiosity. It's about confirming God's design. Education here is less about discovery and more about reinforcement. A fringe tidbit. Some Victorian classrooms used dunce caps, literal tall paper cones labeled dunce, to shame slow learners. The poor child would sit on a stool in the corner while classmates whispered, "It sounds cruel now," but back then, public humiliation was considered a teaching tool. Some schools even kept shame logs, recording each child's sins against attention. If the internet had existed, you can bet there'd have been a leaderboard. Historians still argue whether Victorian education truly democratized learning or merely reproduced class divisions with nicer handwriting. On one side, reformers praised the spread of literacy and the end of ignorance. On the other, critics noted that schools taught children where they belonged. A factory boy learned arithmetic to count inventory, not to dream of universities. A girl learned penmanship and needlework, skills for letters and linens, not leadership. Still, for a child used to the noise of the factory, school offered a strange sort of peace. Even fear could feel predictable. You could memorize the catechism, pass inspection, maybe even earn a certificate, stamped with Queen Victoria's crest. It was proof that you were someone, that you could spell your name, that your life was written in ink, not soot. You lean closer and see a girl, Annie perhaps, copying a passage about obedience. Her fingers are ink-stained, her concentration absolute. Each line must be perfect. Mistakes mean an evening of copying it again. Her stomach growls, but she ignores it. Learning here is as physical as labor. The body must sit still so the soul can be molded. Break time, if you can call it that, lasts 15 minutes. The children spill into a small yard hemmed in by brick walls. There's no playground equipment, just a patch of mud and a few stones that serve as goals for an imaginary game. Laughter bursts out, sudden, unrestrained, and for a fleeting moment, it's actual childhood. A teacher claps once, and the noise stops instantly. Even joy has a curfew. One of the odder educational practices you notice is object lessons. Teachers would hold up random items, a spoon, a potato, a shoe, and ask the class to describe them in moral terms. What can we learn from the potato? A teacher might ask. It grows underground, humble, and useful. Be like the potato. You can't make this up. Victorian kids grew up moralizing their vegetables. The humor almost writes itself. Today's classroom debates revolve around AI ethics and digital citizenship. Back then, you'd get detention for insufficiently admiring a root vegetable. Still, not all was gloom. By the 1880s, some educators began experimenting with kindness, an unorthodox concept at the time. They introduced singing lessons, picture books, and nature walks. The idea that children could learn through curiosity, not fear, was radical. These were the early tremors of what would later become progressive education. But change came unevenly. For every gentle schoolmistress teaching poetry, there were a dozen drill masters insisting that a straight line of writing equals a straight line of conduct. The two philosophies coexisted awkwardly, like a duet between a hymn and a factory whistle. As dusk falls, you watch the children file home. Their slates clatter, their boots leave muddy prints, and the air smells of rain and coal smoke. Annie's mother meets her at the door, wipes her hands on her apron, and asks if she behaved properly. That's the ultimate question. Not, did you learn, but did you obey? Victorian parenting doesn't measure intelligence. It measures compliance. Historians still argue whether these lessons created better citizens or just quieter ones. But here's the paradox. Those same obedient children grew up to fuel revolutions in science, politics, and art. Maybe submission planted seeds of rebellion. Maybe all those rules just gave the next generation something to break. Night falls. A mother lights a candle and watches her daughter copy Bible verses in careful loops. The flame flickers across the girl's face as she writes, "Honor thy father and thy mother." She doesn't yet know that honoring them might one day mean questioning everything they stood for. The candle burns low, and with it, another day's discipline fades into quiet. Tomorrow, lessons will begin again. Different room, different rules. Same belief that education can purify the soul. But soon, another kind of lesson will take over. One about what it means to be a boy or a girl in this tight-laced world, where even toys come with moral expectations. For now, you listen to the chalk still echoing in your head, the rhythm of rote learning that has shaped millions. The line between school and home blurs. Obedience follows children everywhere, You breathe the chalk dust and think, if knowledge is power, the Victorians sure knew how to make it sting. The next morning smells of starch and soap, the signature scent of respectability. The children you've been following have aged just a little, old enough to have opinions, too young to voice them. In Victorian Britain, that gap is where gender takes over. The home becomes a rehearsal stage for adulthood, and parents, armed with strict roles and high hopes, start directing with all the subtlety of drill sergeants. Your mother fusses over your collar while muttering that a proper boy stands straight. If you're a girl, she smooths your dress and reminds you that a lady sits still. There it is. The entire Victorian philosophy in 2 sentences. Men move, women wait. A mainstream historical fact. By the mid-19th century, education and upbringing were rigidly divided by gender. Boys studied Latin, mathematics, and science to prepare for public life, while girls learned needlework, music, and moral instruction to prepare for domesticity. Even toys were segregated. Boys got model cannons, girls got dolls with moral pamphlets tucked into their skirts. The ideal woman was the angel in the house, eternally patient and spotless. The ideal man was industrious, honorable, and allergic to feelings. You, of course, try to survive both ideals. Breakfast is quiet. Father reads the paper, perhaps the Times, while mother pours tea with a precision that borders on liturgy. The children wait to be spoken to. If the son coughs, he's told to be brave. If the daughter laughs too loudly, she's told to be modest. Every moment is a lesson. One quirky tidbit. Toy makers in the 1880s began selling domestic play sets for girls. Tiny brooms, miniature irons, even doll-sized washboards. It was marketed as training for the future mistress of the home. Boys, on the other hand, got chemistry kits and toy rifles. Historians still argue whether these toys reflected society or actively trained it. Maybe both. Walk outside with your Victorian family, and the streets themselves reinforce the script. Posters show heroic explorers in pith helmets and angelic women nursing the poor. Even the songs that drift from pubs and parlors divide neatly. Adventure ballads for men, sentimental lullabies for women. Historians still argue whether this gender order was held up by belief or by fear. Fear that the empire's moral backbone would collapse if women stopped ironing or men started crying. One scholar called it anxious masculinity. Another called it global-scale cosplay. Both might be right. Let's zoom in. You're watching a boy, maybe 12, sitting in a study, learning Latin declensions. His tutor raps the desk whenever his concentration slips. The boy's head droops. He's bored senseless. But this is what fathers pay for. A son who will grow into a gentleman. Education here isn't about ideas. It's about endurance. The future will demand men who can quote Virgil without yawning. Meanwhile, his sister sits across the hall with a governess, learning how to embroider roses onto linen. Each stitch is a sermon in miniature. Patience, precision, humility. She's also practicing piano, not because music is joy, but because it's refinement. Her hands must never grow coarse. Her handwriting must never reveal emotion. And if she ever dreams of something larger, say, writing books, well, she'd better not let anyone see the ink on her fingers. You can sense her rebellion already. Maybe she hides a notebook under her pillow. Maybe she reads the works of George Eliot by candlelight. Maybe she listens with secret awe to the rumors of suffragists marching in distant cities. The humor of it all? Victorian parents truly believed separate spheres would keep everyone happy. Men would protect, women would nurture. The system was so airtight that it could suffocate you with politeness. Dinner scenes tell the whole story. The father carves the roast, daughters pass plates, sons make polite conversation about politics they barely understand. If anyone mentions feelings, an awkward cough travels the table faster than gossip. The ideal meal ends with moral digestion, not emotional ones. But even within this rigidity, small rebellions flicker. A mother encourages her daughter to read improving novels. A father secretly teaches his daughter to ride horseback. A son writes sentimental poetry and hides it under the floorboard. Parenting, even in the strictest homes, never fits the mold perfectly. Then there's the matter of adolescence, a stage Victorians didn't to quite recognize by name, but definitely feared. Boys were sent to boarding school or apprenticeships to keep them away from temptation. Girls were monitored like valuable porcelain. A single rumor could ruin a family's reputation faster than a scandal sheet could print it. Here's another mainstream fact wrapped in moral panic: masturbation hysteria. Medical guides warned parents that solitary vice would cause blindness, insanity, and even death. Some parents fitted boys with chastity belts or alarmed sheets designed to expose movement at night. Doctors sold devices to preserve purity. It's equal parts horrifying and absurd. A whole industry built on anxiety. And the scholarly debate? Historians still argue whether these obsessions were genuine concern for health or disguised fear of losing control over youth. One camp calls it pseudoscience. Another sees it as the first crude attempt at sexual education. Either way, it turned puberty into pathology. Your third gentle joke: imagine explaining to a modern teenager that Victorians feared the moral consequences of the blanket. You'd be trending on TikTok in 5 minutes flat. Yet amid all the control and confusion, something fragile grows, affection that sneaks through the cracks. A father reads a bedtime story from Pilgrim S. Progress and softens his voice when the hero weeps. A mother kisses her daughter's forehead after a long day of needlework. They wouldn't call it love out loud. That word feels too unruly, but it's there, pulsing quietly under the starch. One evening, thunder shakes the windows. The family huddles by the hearth, the candlelight flickering across anxious faces. For once, the rules loosen. Father tells a story from his youth. Mother laughs softly, almost girlishly. The children listen, amazed. For a few minutes, everyone forgets who they're supposed to be. But the fire dies down, the clock ticks forward, and order returns. Tomorrow, we'll bring tutors and tea parties, Latin drills and embroidery hoops. Yet something subtle has shifted. The daughter dares to imagine a different future. The son, perhaps, will question the weight of his authority someday. Outside, the fog presses against the windows again, and you realize this domestic order is more fragile than it seems. It depends on obedience, secrecy, and silence, and all three are about to crumble when you step into the next world, the orphanage. Because not every Victorian child had a family to define their role. Some had institutions, and those buildings, half sanctuary, half prison. Tell a truth, about parenting the Victorians never wanted to face. That love, when outsourced, becomes administration. You step outside, and the air tastes like damp stone and disinfectant. The family you've been following fades into the fog, replaced now by rows of gray buildings that hum with the sound of rules being obeyed. Welcome to the Victorian orphanage, a place where parenting has been industrialized. You don't so much raise children here as process them. Inside, the corridors echo with tiny footsteps. The smell of porridge clings to the walls. Everything is scheduled. Wake-up bell, prayer, meal, work, lesson, prayer again, lights out. The rhythm is so strict, it could run without adults. But of course, adults are everywhere. Matrons, inspectors, superintendents, each convinced they're saving souls through structure. A mainstream historical fact. After the 1834 Poor Law Amendment, England's workhouses and orphanages multiplied. They were meant to replace outdoor relief, offering food and shelter in exchange for discipline. The idea was to teach the poor to be self-reliant. But for children, this often meant long hours of labor, bland meals, and an education limited to obedience and piety. You walk past the dining hall. Rows of children sit in silence, spoons moving in perfect unison like a mechanical clock. They eat what looks like oatmeal, but tastes like wallpaper paste. The matron's boots click on the floor. One misplaced whisper, and she's there, sharp as a sewing needle. Here's the first quiet joke of the night. If you ever complain about cafeteria food, remember Victorian kids would have traded a limb for ketchup. One boy catches your attention. He's maybe 7, small for his age, with eyes that seem to memorize everything. His name tag says J. Whitfield. No surname of his own, just an initial and an identity assigned by ledger. This is how the system sees him, a line item in moral bookkeeping. Historians still argue whether orphanages were acts of mercy or mechanisms of control. On paper, they saved children from starvation. In practice, they often broke spirits as efficiently as they scrubbed floors. But not all were Dickensian nightmares. Some reformers, like Dr. Thomas Barnardo, genuinely believed they were offering salvation. His homes provided shelter, basic education, and sometimes apprenticeships. Still, even Barnardo's system required rigid order. Every bedtime prayer choreographed, every smile subject to moral audit. A fringe tidbit. One London orphanage held an annual inspection day when wealthy patrons would visit to judge the children's progress. The kids were lined up, scrubbed, and dressed in matching uniforms. Patrons would walk through like shoppers in a moral marketplace, sometimes sponsoring one child on the spot. Imagine being graded not just on your manners, but your adaptability. The sensory detail is relentless. Cold soap, thin blankets, shoes that always seem slightly damp. Nights echo with coughing, tuberculosis, rickets, colds that never quite leave. A nurse moves between beds with a lantern, checking for fever, whispering the Lord's Prayer under her breath. You feel a pang of empathy for her too. She's probably an orphan herself, grown into uniformed compassion. Here comes your second joke. You realize that between endless prayers, uniform inspections, and porridge duty, the Victorian orphanage was basically the world's first all-inclusive resort, minus the fun, sunshine, and consent. But humor aside, the emotional temperature in these places was peculiar. Love existed, but it was rationed like sugar. The matrons weren't monsters. They simply believed affection spoiled children. Hugging was a luxury that risked dependency. Better to cultivate gratitude and fear. Those emotions lasted longer. Historians still debate whether Victorian institutional care truly reflected Christian compassion or bureaucratic anxiety. Some records show genuine warmth, matrons writing letters to former wards, sending birthday parcels. Others describe punishment so harsh it bordered on sadism. As usual, the truth is neither myth nor defense. It's the uneasy middle, where human contradiction thrives. You pause in a dormitory. The beds line up like punctuation marks, each with a small Bible at its foot. A child's whisper breaks the stillness. Do you think God knows our names? The question dissolves into the night air unanswered. Out back, there's a small garden where older boys dig and weed. Gardening was considered wholesome, a way to instill moral virtue through nature. But sometimes, the plants die from neglect, just like the lesson they were meant to teach. Still, the orphanage offers peculiar hope. A few children escape its rhythm through talent. One learns to play violin and ends up in a music hall. Another joins the Navy, sees the world, and writes letters home to Mother Superior. These tiny successes were held up as proof the system worked. Parents might not have been present, but the empire was. A massive, invisible father with a stern hand and a global reach. A quirky anecdote buried in records. At some orphanages, donors could adopt children symbolically, receiving yearly updates about their progress. It was like the 19th century version of subscription-based virtue. People collected orphans the way others collected stamps, and yet, amid the paperwork and piety, actual bonds formed. A matron sneaks an extra spoonful of pudding to a child on his birthday. A tutor teaches reading after hours. These small rebellions kept humanity alive in a place built on conformity. You notice something profound, the silence between the bells. When no one's watching, children hum songs from memory, lullabies their mothers might have sung, though they can't recall her face. You feel the ache of that half-memory, how love survives even in absence. Historians still argue whether orphanages were inevitable products of poverty or moral theater for the wealthy. But one thing's clear, they redefined parenting as policy. The government, the church, the philanthropist, all took turns playing mother, and somehow the child was supposed to grow grateful for it. Night again. The wind rattles the shutters. Jay Whitfield lies in his narrow bed, tracing the cracks on the ceiling like constellations. He whispers something, a prayer, maybe a promise, that he'll never be the one who turns the key on another child. You can almost hear the resolve forming, a spark of defiance wrapped in faith. And that spark matters because soon the story will shift to where intimacy takes stranger forms. Not the institution's cold order, but the private world of wet nurses, servants, and bodily exchange. Victorian parenting isn't just about rules. It's about who holds the baby, whose milk feeds it, whose body gets erased in the process. You take one last look at the orphanage gate, iron and imposing, and step through the fog once more. Behind you, the bells toll. Ahead, you can already hear the quiet cry of a newborn and the rustle of silk skirts. The next lesson in love, Victorian style. The wail of a newborn slices through the fog, sharp and trembling. You follow the sound into a parlor that smells of rosewater and coal smoke, where a woman in lace reclines on a chaise, pale and exhausted. The infant in her arms doesn't stay there long. Within minutes, a maid steps forward, curtsies, and carries the baby away to another woman waiting in the servants' quarters. Welcome to the unspoken intimacy of Victorian parenting, the world of wet nurses, servants, and the invisible labor of care. If you were born into money, chances are your mother didn't breastfeed you. The task was delegated, like laundry or letter writing. A wet nurse, usually a working class woman who had recently given birth herself, became both sustenance and secret. The Victorians prized modesty so fiercely that a lady feeding her own child was considered indecorous, even faintly animalistic. Better to hire another woman's body for that. A mainstream historical fact. Wet nursing in Victorian Britain was an established trade, especially among the urban poor. Newspapers and registries listed respectable wet nurses available for hire. Many came from the countryside, leaving their own infants behind to feed the babies of the wealthy. Some even sent milk by train in specially sealed bottles. A strange blend of maternal devotion and industrial logistics. You picture it, the sound of carriages on cobblestone, the clink of milk tins being loaded, the quiet exchange of coins. A baby somewhere grows strong on another woman's nourishment, while that woman's own child weakens in her absence. Historians still argue whether this system was exploitation or necessity. The sensory contrast is brutal. Upstairs, the nursery glows with candlelight and embroidered pillows. Downstairs, the wet nurse sits on a wooden stool, rocking two infants, one borrowed, one her own, if she's lucky enough to keep it near. The air smells of soap, sweat, and milk, a scent so primal it makes you drowsy. Here is your first soft joke. Imagine the Victorian version of a parenting influencer, except instead of posting about breastfeeding schedules, she's quietly negotiating contracts over who gets to breastfeed at all. But this isn't just about feeding, it's about control, about how the upper classes outsourced touch. Nannies, governesses, housemaids, all formed layers between mother and child. The more respectable the family, the less likely parents were to see their own offspring before breakfast. A quirky tidbit. Some employers demanded their wet nurses maintain a strict diet of beef tea and port wine to keep the milk rich. Others measured output with small brass scales, timing feeds with pocket watches. Victorian efficiency met biology, and biology usually lost. Historians still debate whether these rituals came from genuine concern for health or simple class obsession with purity. Perhaps both. A mother's milk wasn't just nourishment, it was social code. You follow the sound of soft singing to a small side room where the nurse, Mary perhaps, hums a lullaby in dialect, one her grandmother taught her. The baby in her arms isn't hers, but she rocks it as if it were. That's the strange tenderness of this arrangement. Love blooming in borrowed spaces. Every so often, she glances toward the door, half expecting the mistress to appear and remind her, don't spoil him with too much rocking. But she does it anyway. Rebellion through rhythm. Meanwhile, upstairs, the mistress writes letters about how beautifully the baby is thriving. She means it sincerely, even though she barely touches him. Parenting in the upper class is about outcomes, not process. The child's plumpness becomes proof of moral worth. Here's your second joke, gentle but pointed. In modern terms, Victorian mothers basically invented ghost parenting. They'd definitely be the ones texting nannies, instructions from the spa. But the story doesn't stay confined to drawing rooms. You wander into working class neighborhoods where there's no luxury of delegation. Mothers labor in laundries, factories, or as charwomen, tying infants to chairs while they scrub floors. The room smells of steam and lye. A baby's cry blends with the hiss of boiling water. These women have no wet nurses, no governesses, just endurance, a fringe tidbit from the archives. Baby farming. Some desperate mothers, unable to care for infants, paid small sums to women who promised to raise them. Many were kind, others were not. The worst cases led to starvation or neglect. It's one of those grim footnotes that makes historians wince. One notorious baby farmer, Amelia Dyer, was later executed for murder. The debate still lingers over whether society's hypocrisy helped create her trade. Historians argue whether baby farming reflected individual cruelty or systemic collapse. A society so obsessed with appearances it forgot compassion. Either way, Victorian Britain managed to turn even motherhood into an economic transaction. Back in the parlor, the mother's friends call, coo over the infant, and praise the child's fine constitution. No one mentions Mary, who is washing cloths in the scullery, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, humming through exhaustion. If she's lucky, she'll keep this position for a year, until her milk dries or a new baby arrives upstairs. Then she'll be dismissed with a reference and maybe a coin. And yet, this system, unfair, impersonal, transactional, still built real emotional bonds. Children often grew more attached to their nurses than their parents. Letters from grown Victorians mention dear old nurse, with more warmth than mama. One even left her entire inheritance to her former nurse, scandalizing her family. The irony drips thicker than the nursery cream. In trying to separate themselves from the animal side of motherhood, upper-class parents ended up proving that affection can't be delegated. As night falls, the household quiets. You can hear the low creak of a cradle rocking. Mary hums again, slower this time, her voice steady as heartbeat. The child's breathing syncs with hers, a borrowed rhythm, a borrowed peace. Historians still argue whether these hidden intimacies undermined or reinforced Victorian class structures. Maybe both. Care has a way of crossing boundaries that etiquette cannot. You watch as the mother tiptoes in unexpectedly. She pauses, watching the nurse and her child asleep in each other's warmth. For a moment, something flickers across her face. Envy, maybe, or longing. She bends down and touches the baby's cheek, then quickly retreats before anyone sees. The room fades, the candle gutters, and you find yourself back in the corridor where portraits of stiff ancestors watch from the walls. The air smells faintly of lavender and loneliness, because the next lesson isn't tea about nourishment or nurture anymore. It is about what Victorians feared most: desire, temptation, and the tightrope walk between purity and hypocrisy. The same society that hired women to feed its infants also built laws to police its youth. The same lips that sang lullabies whispered scandals. So take a breath as you leave the nursery behind. Ahead lies the age of corsets, sermons, and secrets. The Victorian chapter where protection turns into surveillance and innocence becomes a dangerous word. You emerge from the nursery into the long corridor of night, the house quiet except for the ticking of an ornate clock and the soft, repetitive sigh of gas lamps. You think you can finally rest, but this is the hour when Victorian fears wake up, when the same people who preached purity and modesty start whispering about danger, desire, and everything they've tried to bury under lace and scripture. This is where Victorian parenting turns into moral surveillance. The line between love and control becomes so thin it almost vanishes. You step into a parlor where a father paces in front of the fire, newspaper trembling in his hands. The headline screams, "Youth corrupted by vice, public decency in peril." His jaw tightens. His daughter, 16 maybe, sits by the window, sewing quietly. She doesn't look up. She doesn't have to. She knows this conversation is coming, a mainstream historical fact. By the late 19th century, Victorian Britain was obsessed with sexual purity. The Contagious Diseases Acts, from 1864 onward, allowed police to detain and medically examine women suspected of prostitution, often without evidence. The laws were supposed to protect soldiers from venereal disease, but instead criminalized poverty and femininity itself. Respectable parents lived in constant fear that their daughters might be compromised, even by rumor, so fathers locked diaries away. Mothers chaperoned every walk. Young people were taught to treat their own bodies like ticking bombs of temptation. Modesty manuals instructed girls never to look in mirrors too long, lest vanity lead to sin. Boys were warned that idle thoughts could lead to madness, sometimes literally. Historians still argue whether this obsession stemmed from genuine morality or from social panic over urbanization, disease, and class mobility. Whatever the cause, the result was a national anxiety attack disguised as virtue. A fringe tidbit: some Victorian households installed modesty boards under piano legs to cover what they considered the instrument's suggestive curves. Furniture needed chastity too, apparently. Imagine walking into a living room and blushing at mahogany. Your first quiet joke: if Freud had visited earlier, he could have made a fortune just diagnosing furniture. But beneath the absurdity lies something darker. This paranoia trickled down into parenting, especially adolescence. The teenage girl in that parlor, let's call her Clara, knows every rule about comportment. She knows to lower her gaze when addressed, to never be alone with a man, to speak softly, even when spoken to harshly. Her parents love her, but their love feels like surveillance. Every letter she writes is inspected. Every book she reads is screened. Even the word leg is replaced by limb in polite conversation. She dreams of freedom in the same way some people dream of oxygen. The second joke, mild but pointed: Victorian kids didn't get the talk. They got the silence, and somehow that was supposed to make them pure. Still, the fear wasn't just about girls. Boys faced their own form of moral policing. Medical journals warned of self-abuse with an intensity that bordered on hysteria. Parents bought mechanical devices, rings, straps, even alarmed bed sheets to keep sons from falling. You can almost hear the clockwork ticking under all that repression. Historians still debate whether this moral panic was the result of sincere ignorance or deliberate social engineering. One camp calls it pseudoscience. Another calls it propaganda to maintain gender hierarchy. Either way, it left a generation terrified of their own skin. And yet, because human nature is stubborn, desire still found ways to breathe. Courting rituals blossomed in coded letters, secret glances, and carefully orchestrated accidental encounters at church bazaars. A dropped glove became an event. A shared umbrella could ruin reputations. Meanwhile, parenting manuals urged vigilance. Mothers, guard your daughters' hearts, one wrote, for the wolf is patient. The wolf, of course, might have been the postman, but hypocrisy lurked everywhere. Fathers who preached chastity to their daughters often visited London's underworld of brothels and music halls. The same society that censored romantic novels devoured gossip columns. Love was forbidden, but scandal sold by the pound. A quirky anecdote from the archives. In 1895, a London preacher publicly condemned the corruption of youth through unwholesome fiction. His own daughter later became a romance novelist. Poetic justice inked in defiance. One could almost feel sorry for these parents trying to navigate a world where reputation was worth more than honesty. To lose social standing was to lose everything: marriage prospects, employment, belonging. Fear made them overprotective, love made them inconsistent. Still, the repression seeped deep. Clara's diary entries, if she ever dared keep one, would read like coded prayers. I walked to the shop today. I saw a man smile. I did not sin. She's half convinced she's already guilty of something unnamed. And yet, even within this suffocating moral maze, tiny acts of rebellion bloom. Clara hides a banned novel behind her sewing box. She steals minutes by the window to watch the street. She wonders, just wonders, what it would be like to choose her own story. Your third small joke. Imagine if Victorian parents had social media. They'd install chaperones in the comments section, but laughter fades as you notice how fear corrodes affection. Fathers withdraw into lectures, mothers into sighs. Children learn that silence equals safety. Families that once sang hymns together now whisper instead. Historians still argue whether Victorian sexual repression was as universal as we imagine. Some diaries suggest more tenderness, even humor, behind closed doors. The truth probably lived in the same place as most truths, in the gray zones between sermon and sigh. And those gray zones mattered, because when parents deny touch, imagination takes over. That imagination would one day burst into art, poetry, even reform movements that shook the empire's moral foundations. You can already sense it in Clara's restless pen strokes, in the way she gazes toward the horizon beyond the window lace. Outside, gaslights flicker against fog, turning London into a ghostly dreamscape of secrets. Somewhere, a clock strikes midnight. The family retires to their separate rooms, each convinced they're protecting the other. But you can feel the pressure building, the contradictions of purity and power, science and superstition, truth and fear. And soon, that tension will erupt in the strangest way possible, through the rise of pseudoscience and the obsession with measuring morality, through skulls, charts, and child study. So, as the last lamp dims, remember this. For Victorians, innocence was a full-time job. Tomorrow, it will become a laboratory experiment. The next morning arrives, not with sunlight, but with the dull grayness of London, filtered through soot and superstition. You blink and find yourself surrounded by shelves of gleaming instruments, calipers, measuring tapes, skullcasts, and mysterious charts. Welcome to the strange new world where Victorian parenting met pseudoscience, where love and fear found justification in data. It's the 1880s, And parents now have a new set of experts whispering in their ears, scientists, doctors, and philosophers who promise to explain, perhaps even perfect, the child. You can almost hear the pitch. Why rely on instinct when you can raise your offspring scientifically? A mainstream historical fact. This was the age when eugenics, phrenology, and the emerging science of childhood took root. Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin, coined the term eugenics in 1883, suggesting that human traits could be improved through selective breeding. The idea spread like wildfire among the middle and upper classes, who began to see family planning not as private life, but as patriotic duty. Historians still argue whether this was true science or a social panic wearing a lab coat. The data were often dubious, but the confidence was immense. Victorians adored measurement of skulls, intelligence, morality. If it could be charted, it could be controlled. Your first gentle joke. Victorian parents didn't need parenting podcasts. They had phrenology charts. Your child's frontal bump suggests a talent for obedience. Mrs. Smythe, you watch a mother in a respectable dress sit anxiously while a child expert examines her son's head. The man squints, hums, and declares that the boy shows signs of willfulness, bordering on rebellion. The mother gasps. The boy, of course, is just bored, but his skull now carries a diagnosis. Phrenology, that peculiar blend of anatomy and fortune-telling, promised to reveal character through the bumps of the skull. It sounds absurd now, but back then, it shaped everything, from education to employment. Parents used it to justify discipline or favoritism. A child with a bump of destructiveness might find himself caned more often, just in case. The fringe tidbit: some families kept phrenological busts in their parlors next to the piano, each labeled with moral attributes: benevolence, firmness, veneration. Guests would stand around them like they were personality quizzes carved in plaster. The Victorians basically invented the original BuzzFeed quiz, minus the cats. But beyond the parlor parodies, something more troubling was brewing. Eugenics gave respectable parents permission to turn love into arithmetic. Marry well, breed carefully, manage your lineage like a stock portfolio. Newspapers ran advice columns urging readers to consider mental soundness before marriage. Babies became proof of national virtue. You can feel the chill of it. The way affection starts sounding like a census form. A couple beams proudly over their sleeping infant, whispering about good breeding, not realizing they sound more like farmers than parents. Historians still debate whether these ideas were genuine belief in progress or thinly veiled classism. Some saw eugenics as moral hygiene, others as social warfare, disguised as science. Either way, it was a convenient tool for control. At the same time, another movement emerged: child study. Reformers like James Sully and G. Stanley Hall began observing children systematically, noting their development, play, and behavior. For the first time, childhood itself became an object of research. Parents read articles explaining phases of defiance, stages of moral growth, and signs of genius. It was equal parts compassion and curiosity, and sometimes just plain creepy. Here's your second quiet joke. Imagine being a Victorian kid and realizing your temper tantrum is being peer-reviewed. But it wasn't all bad. Some of these early child study efforts laid the groundwork for modern psychology and education reform. They suggested that children weren't miniature adults. They had their own rhythms, emotions, and needs. The notion was revolutionary. For once, the word understanding entered parenting vocabulary, even if it sat awkwardly beside obedience. Yet, like everything Victorian, kindness tangled with control. These same parents timed naps to the minute, charted height and weight obsessively, and analyzed handwriting for moral weakness. Science became scripture, data the new devotion. A particularly strange anecdote from 1890, one London school headmaster proudly displayed graphs comparing his pupils' moral improvement to their skull circumference. The taller the chart, the more civilized the class. It was absurd and terrifyingly sincere. Meanwhile, the family dinner table turned into a symposium. Fathers quoted Herbert Spencer while carving meat. Mothers read aloud from health manuals, warning about hereditary hysteria. The children sat quietly, absorbing not just food, but the conviction that their worth was measurable. Historians still argue whether this scientific parenting was progress or another form of repression. Some call it the birth of modern psychology, others, the death of intuition. And beneath it all lurked something deeply human, a craving for certainty. Victorian parents had seen too much unpredictability, disease, poverty, mortality. If a caliper could promise safety, even falsely, who wouldn't cling to it? Still, you can sense fatigue creeping into these families. The mother who once trusted phrenology starts doubting it. The father begins to suspect that moral character isn't a cranial feature. A teacher throws away her measuring charts after realizing her most hopeless pupil writes the most beautiful poems. And there's the paradox. For all their obsession with classification, Victorians were creating the very rebellion that would undo them. Their children grew up skeptical of authority, hungry for individuality, tired of being measured. You can almost hear them whispering, in the next century's dawn, maybe love doesn't need a chart. Your third quiet joke. It is hard to believe the same culture that invented skull reading also invented the tea break. But perhaps one was needed to recover from the other. The lamps flicker lower. A scientist scribbles in his notebook by candlelight, convinced he's saving civilization, one measurement at a time. Outside his window, children laugh in the street. Free, unpredictable, unmeasurable. Their echoes drift upward like a soft rebuttal. Historians still argue whether these experiments were necessary steps toward enlightenment or detours into arrogance. Maybe both. But as the century ages, you can feel something shifting, a slow rebellion, not just in science, but in spirit. The Victorians' need for certainty will soon meet something stronger. Faith, confession, and moral duty. This time filtered through the quiet surveillance of religion. So, take one last look at the calipers and charts. The next room holds rosaries, hymnals, and whispered prayers. The instruments change, but the purpose stays the same, to shape the soul. The scientific instruments fade into the shadows, and in their place rises the faint scent of incense and candle wax. You find yourself inside a drawing room, transformed into a chapel, velvet curtains drawn, a wooden cross gleaming in the candlelight. The hum of the outside world muffles here. Even the air feels heavier, filled with expectation. This is the heart of Victorian moral life, where parenting meets piety, and control wears the halo of salvation. Everywhere you look, you see devotion masquerading as discipline. Families kneel together in evening prayer. Children's heads bow in rhythm with parental sighs. You can almost feel the rugs worn thin where knees have pressed, night after night. A mainstream historical fact. By the mid-19th century, religion was the cornerstone of child rearing in Britain. Whether Anglican, Methodist, Catholic, or nonconformist, families believed the soul of a nation depended on the moral fiber of its children. Parents weren't just caretakers, they were stewards of eternal destiny. Spare the rod and spoil the child wasn't just a proverb, it was divine instruction. Historians still argue whether this deep religiosity produced comfort or anxiety. Some claim it fostered moral stability in chaotic times. Others insist it trained guilt into the bone. The truth, as always, probably knelt somewhere in between. You sit with a mother, let's call her Mrs. Allen, whose Bible lies open beside her embroidery hoop. She hums hymns as her children copy verses by candlelight. One child dozes, drooling onto the book of Proverbs, earning a sharp nudge. Mrs. Allen doesn't scold loudly. Her discipline comes in whispers. The Lord sees even closed eyes. Your first gentle joke. Victorian moms didn't need baby monitors. They had omniscient theology. But for many, faith wasn't gentle at all. In some households, religion became the most intimate form of surveillance. Parents believed every stray thought could tilt a soul toward damnation. Children were taught to confess dreams, fleeting envy, even boredom during prayer. The result was a generation that measured conscience, like others measured coin, the fringe tidbit. There existed sin diaries, little notebooks where children logged their daily moral slips, lying, selfishness, lack of gratitude. Parents reviewed them weekly, like spiritual report cards. Imagine being grounded by God's middle management. Mrs. Allen's eldest son, Thomas, writes his entries in tiny letters, ashamed of a wicked impulse to skip church. He's 10. His father nods gravely, prays over him, and reads aloud a sermon about obedience. Outside, rain hammers against the window like impatient applause. Historians still debate whether these practices truly damaged children or merely reflected an era when moral language replaced psychological one. Sin was how they named what we might now call anxiety. Redemption stood in for therapy. Still, the church's reach went beyond the household. Sunday schools became moral factories, teaching not only scripture, but class hierarchy. Poor children learned obedience and cleanliness. Rich children learned benevolence and restraint. One teacher boasted in a letter that she had whipped the laziness out of sick souls before tea. You exhale softly. The irony smells like candle smoke. And yet, faith also brought beauty. Hymns floated through cracked windows, warming cold streets. Charitable societies sprang up. Ragged schools, orphan missions, penny collections for the poor. Many Victorians genuinely believed they were building a moral utopia, one verse at a time. Your second quiet joke. Victorian charity was so enthusiastic that even sinners needed an appointment to be pitied. But religion also divided families. Revivalist movements swept through towns like emotional hurricanes. Some parents dragged reluctant children to tent meetings where crowds wept, trembled, and fainted under divine fervor. The experience could be ecstatic or traumatic, One teenager later wrote, "I feared God loved everyone but me." Historians still argue whether these revivals strengthened community or weaponized guilt. Either way, they left behind an emotional landscape of longing and fear. You drift now to a quieter home, a Quaker family in rural Yorkshire. Here, faith breathes differently. No fire and brimstone sermons, just silence. Children learn stillness, reflection, compassion. They bake bread for neighbors and read poetry as worship. Not every Victorian child trembled under wrath. Some glowed in gentleness. The empire, vast as it was, contained multitudes of belief. And then there's the eccentric side of devotion, the fringe expressions that slipped between orthodoxy and oddity. One London sect taught that children's laughter attracted angels. They forbade scolding before bedtime, lest the spirits take offense. Another family reportedly baptized dolls to ensure the salvation of innocent representations. Victorians never lacked imagination. They simply spiritualized everything that moved and some things that didn't. You chuckle softly when even your toy needs saving. You know it's a serious century. Still, underneath the lace and hymns, religion gave shape to something profound, the desire to make sense of suffering. Infant mortality, poverty, cholera, all demanded explanation. Faith offered one, however grim. Parents told themselves that dead children were called home early, their small coffins softened by heaven's promise. It was theology as anesthesia. And perhaps that's why Victorian religiosity survived even as science rose. It offered warmth where measurement offered cold logic. The two weren't always enemies. They danced, sometimes clumsily, around the same questions. What makes a soul? What saves it? By late century, new movements stirred. Spiritualism, seances, ghost photography. The grieving turned to mediums who promised to connect them with lost sons and daughters. Even Queen Victoria herself attended seances after Prince Albert's death, desperate for one more conversation through the veil. The private act of mourning became public fascination. Historians still debate whether this spiritualist craze was faith or fraud, therapy or theater. Whatever it was, it revealed a truth about Victorian hearts. They could not bear silence from the ones they loved. As you stand there, the candles gutter low. Mrs. Allen closes her Bible and kisses each child's forehead before bed. Her hand trembles, just slightly. You realize faith, for all its strictness, is also fear in disguise, the fear of losing what little one can control. Your third quiet joke. Sleep well, darling, and remember, God's watching is possibly the least relaxing lullaby ever composed. And yet, when the lamps finally go out, there's tenderness in the dark. The father's hand rests gently on his son's shoulder. The mother hums a hymn softer than breath. Belief and love coexist, awkward but sincere. Historians still argue whether Victorian piety ultimately helped children grow or simply trained them to hide. Maybe it did both. But from these candlelit rooms emerged a generation that would start asking bigger questions about morality, justice, and who gets to define them. Because soon, reformers will arrive at the door, holding petitions instead of prayer books, demanding that compassion be written into law. And when they do, the hymn will turn into a rallying cry. The next sound you hear isn't a hymn, it's a rally. Voices rising from cobblestone streets, echoing through fog, carrying petitions and pamphlets instead of psalms. The century is aging, and the Victorians, so proud of their order, are beginning to squirm under the weight of their own conscience. Reformers are coming, and they're bringing children with them, not as followers, but as evidence. You step out into the gray morning and join the flow of humanity toward a city square where banners ripple like restless wings. One reads, "Every child deserves a childhood." Another, "No more babies in the mines." The air smells of coal dust and conviction, a mainstream historical fact. By the late 1800s, social reform movements were transforming Britain. Campaigns against child labor, for compulsory education, and for public health reforms were in full swing. The Factory Acts limited working hours for children. The 1870 Education Act made basic schooling accessible, and organizations like the NSPCC, founded in 1884, emerged to protect children from cruelty at home. Historians still argue whether these reforms were driven by compassion or convenience. Some say they reflected genuine moral awakening. Others claim they were about producing better workers and citizens for the empire. Either way, parenting was about to face its biggest audit yet. In the crowd, you spot a woman, small, determined, clutching a notebook. Her name is Mary Carpenter, a real historical figure, pioneer of reform schools and tireless advocate for neglected youth. She believed every wayward child could be saved through education rather than punishment. You watch her step onto a wooden crate, voice trembling but fierce, as she declares, "Children are not criminals. They are citizens waiting to be heard." Your first gentle joke. Imagine saying that in a century where some still thought laughter could lead to sin. It was practically rebellion with punctuation. Yet Carpenter wasn't alone. Reformers like Lord Shaftesbury, Josephine Butler, and Octavia Hill fought on different fronts: factory floors, tenement halls, and moral battlegrounds. They used pamphlets, photographs, and statistics to make the invisible visible. One famous image, a soot-streaked child asleep under a factory loom, traveled through newspapers like a ghost of conscience. Still, change wasn't swift. Parents accused reformers of meddling. Clergy warned against undermining divine order. "Spare the rod, spoil the empire," sneered one satirical magazine. But the tide was turning. For every sermon on obedience, there was a speech on dignity, a fringe tidbit. One reformer in 1886 tried to start a society for the protection of naughty boys. It lasted 3 meetings before disbanding. Apparently, the naughty boys in question refused to attend. Even so, reform took shape in strange ways. Ragged schools for poor children sprang up across Britain, funded by philanthropists and volunteers. These classrooms smelled of chalk and hope, filled with kids who had never owned shoes or pencils. Teachers juggled chaos and compassion, trying to turn a street survival into structure. You pause at a doorway where a lesson is in progress. The teacher, a young woman with ink-stained fingers, writes "work and kindness" on the slate. The children copy it clumsily, whispering the words like magic spells. Outside, the city roars on, indifferent and immense. Historians still debate whether these schools truly helped or merely disciplined poverty into respectability. Was compassion just control in softer clothes? The evidence is mixed. Some former pupils became teachers themselves. Others slipped back into the streets, carrying new alphabets, but the same hunger. Your second quiet joke. Victorian charity often came with homework. "We fed you. Now write an essay about gratitude. Meanwhile, the law began catching up. The Cruelty to Children Act of 1889, often called the Children S. Charter, made it illegal to beat or neglect a child excessively. For the first time, the state claimed a right to step inside the home. Parents cried outrage. Reformers called it progress. Either way, the walls of domestic privacy cracked open. It's strange to realize how radical it was to say that children weren't property. To us, it feels obvious. To them, it was heresy. The idea that a parent's love could be questioned by law struck at the very heart of Victorian pride. Yet, beneath that discomfort lay relief. Perhaps some parents wanted help, but didn't know how to ask. You drift toward another corner of the movement, the moral reformers. Josephine Butler, fierce and eloquent, campaigns to repeal the Contagious Diseases Acts that humiliated women in the name of public health. She argues that purity should begin with justice, not inspection. Men scoff, newspapers mock, yet she persists. A woman speaking for children and women in the 1880s was like a candle, arguing with a storm and somehow winning. Historians still argue whether these activists were guided by empathy or a missionary zeal that sometimes ignored the voices they claimed to defend. Compassion in the Victorian era was often paternalistic. Help the poor, but don't invite them to dinner. Still, you can't help admiring their courage. Imagine standing before Parliament, corset laced tight, trembling hands gripping a stack of petitions, while rows of skeptical men mutter behind cigars. And still, she speaks. The fringe reformers were even stranger. Some preached vegetarianism as moral purity. Others built child colonies in Canada and Australia to rescue destitute youth, an idea that now feels disturbingly close to exile. Historians still debate whether those exported children were saved or stolen. Your third quiet joke. Victorian reformers invented the original send the kids to camp, except camp was an entire continent away, and yet change rippled outward. Newspapers began publishing sentimental fiction about children, the street urchin with a golden heart, the angelic orphan who melts the miser. Dickens led the way, but soon imitators followed. Every tear shed over Oliver Twist was another drop in the flood of reform. Literature became the moral megaphone of a weary conscience. You find yourself back in that city square, now quieter. The crowd has dispersed, leaving pamphlets fluttering like fallen leaves. A single child sweeps them into a pile, his broom twice his height. The future still feels uncertain, but at least now it exists. Historians still argue whether Victorian reform was revolution or renovation. Maybe it was both, a patchwork of good intentions stitched over centuries of cruelty. But from these movements came the first whispers of something we now take for granted, that childhood is not a moral obstacle course, but a protected space for growth. The lamps along the street ignite one by one. You can hear church bells mingling with factory whistles, the hymn of an age slowly changing key. And somewhere, in a quiet home, a mother reads the newspaper and sighs, not because reform has arrived, but because she realizes she no longer needs to fear it. Tomorrow, though, she'll face a new dilemma. What happens when this idea of proper parenting travels beyond Britain, across oceans into colonies, where cultures collide, and the empire's morality meets its hypocrisy? Head on, take a breath, because the world is about to get much bigger. The map unfurls before you like a vast sepia-toned quilt. Rail lines stretch like veins, ships trace white arcs across oceans, and the empire's red stains spread over continents. Victorian parenting, once confined to parlors and nurseries, is packing its trunks. You can almost hear the moral lectures being folded neatly between layers of linen, ready for export. You stand on a bustling London dock in the 1890s. Steamships groan, gulls scream, and families wave handkerchiefs as missionaries, civil servants, and soldiers board. Somewhere among them are mothers with infants, governesses with trembling hands, and fathers convinced that civilization can fit inside a travel case. The empire isn't just moving goods and laws, it's carrying its child-rearing manual like scripture, a mainstream historical fact. The British Empire's reach transformed family life across the globe. In colonies, from India to Australia, European norms of education, discipline, and domesticity were imposed, or at least attempted, on diverse cultures with their own systems of care. Missionary schools trained not just converts but future model citizens. Native customs were often dismissed as backward or immoral. Parenting became politics. Historians still argue whether this was benevolence or cultural arrogance. Some describe it as moral outreach. Others call it the soft weapon of empire. Whatever the label, it left fingerprints on generations of children who never asked for the lesson. Your first gentle joke. Victorian parenting on tour. Same rules. New humidity. You follow a missionary family stepping ashore in Calcutta. The father adjusts his hat, muttering about temperance in the tropics. The mother clutches her parasol as though it's faith itself. Their two pale children stare wide-eyed at the colors, the noise, the smells, spices, heat, life that refuses to be tamed. A local nursemaid guides them through the market. She's the one who truly knows how to keep them alive. But no one writes her name in the letters home. In missionary compounds, lessons begin at dawn. Children of converts recite scripture beside British pupils, their voices blending awkwardly across accents. Posters warn against heathen influences. The same moral language that once governed London. Drawing rooms now polices entire nations. Cleanliness is next to godliness, reads one sign, pinned above a wash basin. The irony, of course, is that the empire's own conscience remains anything but clean. Historians still debate whether these educational missions were altruistic or economic strategy. Was the goal to uplift or to produce compliant clerks and servants fluent in English virtue? You shift scenes to Australia, where child migration programs are gathering momentum. Ships arrive with what officials call home children, orphans and poor youth, exported from Britain to populate the colonies. The theory is noble on paper. Give them opportunity, remove them from vice. The reality, often brutal. Many end up in harsh labor, far from the families they barely remember. A fringe tidbit. One colonial administrator proudly referred to this project as transplanting the moral garden. You imagine a gardener who's never noticed the roots. Your second quiet joke. Victorian bureaucrats clearly skipped the chapter on watering instructions. And then there's Africa, where missionary schools teach not only reading, but European gender norms. Boys learn command, girls learn compliance. The rhythm of native lullabies fades beneath imported hymns. Yet, cultures are resilient. Mothers hum both songs, weaving rebellion into melody. Even as colonizers preach salvation, the children learn dual languages, one for survival, one for remembering. Historians still argue whether these children internalized empire or quietly resisted it. Diaries hint at both. One Indian student wrote of learning Shakespeare by day and Sanskrit chants by night. The tongue is a bridge, he said, but sometimes it burns. Back in London, reports from the colonies fill parlors with pride. Our little ones bring light to the heathen, writes a bishop, oblivious that the light blinds as much as it shines. Parenting manuals even include chapters on child management abroad, warning against native nurses who might spoil with softness. The irony drips thicker than treacle. Yet, not every colonial parent fit the stereotype. Some learned from the lands they occupied, adopting local foods, fabrics, even philosophies. An eccentric British widow in Burma taught her children meditation, calling it Christian contemplation with better posture. Society back home labeled her scandalous. Modern historians might call her curious. Your third gentle joke, Victorian open-mindedness existed. It just needed a 50-year visa. Still, for many, empire parenting meant distance. Fathers posted overseas left children in Britain, under the care of schools or relatives, creating the archetype of the boarding school orphan. Letters traveled months across oceans, carrying reprimands written in ink that outlasted affection. Be good, remember duty, honor the queen. Between those lines lay the ache of separation. Historians still debate whether the empire strengthened or shattered family bonds. It offered prosperity to some, estrangement to others. The same steamships that carried opportunity also ferried loneliness. You find yourself now in a classroom in Cape Town, 1900. A teacher, British, stern but weary, holds up a globe. This, she tells her mixed group of students, is the empire on which the sun never sets. A boy raises his hand. Then when do the children sleep? The class giggles until she hushes them, though even she hides a smile. The joke lands heavier than intended, because the truth is, the children of empire never truly rested. They were expected to inherit ideals they didn't invent, to uphold civility measured in someone else's language. And while Victorian Britain congratulated itself on progress, it overlooked the quiet rebellions in its own nurseries abroad, the stories told in native tongues after lights out, the lullabies that refused translation. A quirky but real anecdote. In 1898, a missionary journal published a poem written by a young African student thanking Mother England for education. Decades later, scholars discovered marginal notes in the original, lines in the student's own language translating to, "They taught us letters, but forgot our names." Historians still argue whether empire's cultural exchange was a dialogue or a monologue. But for every missionary manual printed, another story whispered itself into survival. You glance again at the map. The red territories begin to fade into twilight, the borders softening like watercolor. The empire's power will wane, but its parenting model, the belief that authority equals virtue, will outlive it by generations. The ship bells toll across the harbor as the scene fades. Somewhere, a mother hushes her child under a sky that isn't hers, but feels like home anyway. And across the sea, another mother reads the same Bible verse in a different tongue, unaware that they are both singing to the same stars. The Victorian world is closing its eyes, but it hasn't learned how to rest. Tomorrow, you'll see what happens when the modern world opens them and judges what came before. The map fades from empire red to pixel blue, and when you open your eyes again, you're back in the present, or almost. The year is modern, but the air is still scented faintly with coal dust and lavender polish. You're standing between centuries, watching the past explain itself awkwardly to the future. Victorian parents would have called this meeting a trial, and in a sense, it is. You glance around the imagined courtroom. Fluorescent lights hum softly overhead. Rows of modern spectators sit with smartphones glowing like pocket lanterns. On one side stand the Victorians, buttoned up, nervous, clutching prayer books and canes. On the other side, the modern world, armed with social workers, psychologists, and child protection laws. The bailiff clears his throat. Case number 2025A. The People versus Victorian Parenting. The charge, cruelty by modern standards. You exhale, because this is going to get awkward fast. A mainstream historical fact. By the 21st century, nearly every major Victorian parenting norm would be illegal or condemned. Corporal punishment banned in most Western schools. Child labor outlawed globally, at least on paper, and children's rights recognized as international law under the 1989 UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. What was once seen as moral duty is now reclassified as abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Historians still argue whether it's fair to judge the past by the ethics of the present. Is it justice or anachronism? Can you condemn a parent who thought the belt was mercy because that is all they do ever known? Your first quiet joke. Somewhere in the afterlife, a Victorian father is probably muttering, "Back in my day, grounding meant the mines." You take your seat in the imaginary gallery as the evidence is presented. Exhibit A, the workhouse. Rows of children, pale and silent, sewing sacks for pennies. Exhibit B, the classroom, where a single mispronounced Latin verb earns a cane strike. Exhibit C, the nursery, where babies are swaddled so tightly they can't move for their own good. The jurors, modern viewers all, shake their heads. The Victorians shift uncomfortably, unsure which part looks worst under fluorescent light. But then comes Exhibit D, the love letters, the diaries, the family portraits, parents who wrote, "My darling boy, pray for me when you say your lessons." Mothers who fought cholera and starvation just to keep one more child alive. You realize this trial isn't about villains. It's about limits. How much cruelty can coexist with care before the balance breaks? Historians still debate the emotional truth of Victorian parenting. Some describe it as icy and repressed. Others, newly affectionate in the wake of Enlightenment rationalism. Letters and memoirs hint at tenderness peeking through discipline. A father building a kite for his son. A mother secretly reading fairy tales, banned by moralists. Humans inconveniently refuse to fit verdicts. A fringe tidbit. Some Victorian reformers actually proposed banning spanking altogether. In 1896, the motion was laughed out of Parliament. One MP joked that it would emasculate the empire. The irony, as you now know, is that the empire would collapse within a generation, spanking or not. Your second quiet joke. Emasculate the empire. Sounds like a terrible name for a punk band, but you'd still buy the t-shirt. As testimony continues, the prosecution calls in modern psychology. Experts cite studies on trauma, attachment, and developmental harm. The Victorian defense, responds with sermons on duty and discipline. Children must learn obedience, insists one father, slamming his palm on the stand. Or they'll grow wild. The modern judge leans forward. Perhaps, she says softly, they were never wild, just curious. That silence afterward could last a century. The courtroom dissolves into metaphor again, and you find yourself walking through the remnants of the past. Abandoned nurseries, faded portraits, rusted playground swings that squeak like old apologies. The ghosts of Victorian children are everywhere, not haunting, just watching. They look curious, not angry. You realize they were the first to live in a world that believed children could be made better, even if the method was brutal. Historians still argue whether Victorian cruelty was the seed of modern compassion. Maybe we only learned tenderness because they failed so spectacularly at enforcing it. Maybe empathy was their unintended legacy. You crouch beside one of those ghostly children, hair parted, knees scabbed, clutching a slate. What would you want? You ask softly. If you could speak now, the answer comes not in words, but in a faint echo of laughter, the kind that doesn't yet know shame. That's when you realize this isn't a trial at all. It's therapy for both sides. Because yes, Victorian parenting would be illegal today. The canes, the labor, the emotional silence, the moral surveillance, each a crime by modern code. But what about the impulse beneath it? The desperate need to protect in a dangerous world, to prepare children for survival when comfort was scarce and death was common. Fear made them cruel, hope made them stubborn, and both built the scaffolding of the modern parent you know now, your third gentle joke. So, in a way, you're just the upgraded model, Victorian 2.0, now with empathy patches and fewer belts. Still, the mirror is uncomfortable. When you see a modern parent shouting at a child to hurry up, when a school drills competition, more than creativity, when social media shames imperfect parenting, you can almost hear the echo of that old voice. Be good. Be quiet. Be worthy. Maybe the past isn't dead. It just logs in differently. Historians still debate whether we've truly escaped Victorian moralism or just digitized it. Discipline once came from pulpits and headmasters. Now it comes from algorithms, school rankings, and viral outrage. Different tools, same pressure. You step outside the courtroom, and dawn breaks across the skyline. The fog lifts, revealing 2 centuries intertwined. Chimney smoke, fading into cloud. Horse carts, giving way to cars. You think of all those parents, from Mrs. Allen to Mary Carpenter, who tried, failed, and tried again to define what love should look like. You think of all those children who survived it, who learned to whisper their own names when the world refused to. Victorian parenting would be illegal today, but it is also the reason we know what legal should look like. The bruises became boundaries, the silence became speech, the fear became a demand for tenderness, and as you turn to leave, you feel something like forgiveness, not approval, just understanding, because every generation raises its children in the dark, hoping the light will find them before the next dawn. The lamps flicker off, the ghosts of the Victorians fade, leaving only the soft hum of present-day quiet. Somewhere, a modern child laughs in the next room, a sound no longer measured, charted, or feared, just lived. That's when you know the story can rest. You're still standing in the quiet after that imagined verdict. The courtroom gone, the air clear. The world outside hums softly, neon mixing with starlight. Victorian London has dissolved, the chimneys replaced by apartment windows, but the ghosts haven't left entirely. They've just learned to scroll. You can feel them in the parenting blogs, the morning routines, the guilt that hums in every should. So tonight, as you drift through this final stretch, it's not about blame anymore. It's about recognition. You've seen what came before, and how much of it we carry still. If a Victorian parent could step into a 21st century home, the shock might short-circuit them. No canes, no child maids, no soot-dark factories, just pastel nurseries, baby monitors, and bedtime affirmations whispered in low, loving tones. They'd marvel at laws that say a child's voice matters. They'd stare at therapy sessions that unspool family wounds once kept secret for generations. And, let's be honest, they'd probably faint at how much sugar kids get away with now. A mainstream historical fact. The modern idea of children's rights is younger than most of your grandparents. Only after 2 world wars did the world agree that children weren't miniature workers or moral experiments. They were individuals deserving protection. The Victorians built the scaffolding. We finally finished the roof. Your first gentle joke. If those Victorian parents saw a toddler negotiating bedtime with a 3-minute YouTube video, they'd call for an exorcism. Still, the echoes linger. We inherited their anxieties, the obsession with achievement, the fear of moral decay, the pressure to perform goodness. They just traded lace collars for language like personal branding and growth mindset. Historians still argue whether modern parenting truly escaped that old architecture or just redecorated it with a softer lighting. And yet, it's hard not to admire their strange mix of grit and faith. They believed, almost irrationally, that love could be manufactured through effort, that every scrubbed floor, every memorized verse, every stiff upper lip bedtime routine could somehow shape better souls. In the dim candlelight of 1880, that was their form of hope. A fringe tidbit. Some late Victorian mothers kept virtue charts above cradles, ticking off moral progress like growth spurts. Modern psychologists might cringe, but those mothers were improvising science with the only tools they had: ink, guilt, and prayer. Your second joke. Imagine if they still had parenting apps, Victorian mothers comparing virtue tracker stats at tea parties. So, why would Victorian parenting be illegal today? Because the world finally acknowledged what they couldn't write up, that children aren't moral projects. They re-people. You can't legislate innocence or beat wisdom into existence. You can only guide, listen, and let time work its quiet miracles. Historians still debate how to judge them. Some say moral progress demands hard lines. Wrong is wrong. Others whisper that empathy means recognizing context, that survival in the 1800s required toughness modern comfort can't fathom. Both are true. Compassion is the bridge between them. You take a slow breath. The fog of coal smoke, chalk dust, and lavender polish fades completely now. You see what's left. Lessons, warnings, a kind of blueprint drawn in the margins of history. The Victorian era taught us how not to parent, but also how desperately parents need guidance, structure, and community. Their extremes forced the world to ask what love should feel like when power meets vulnerability. Without their mistakes, you wouldn't have modern empathy or laws protecting children's laughter from labor's noise. Your third gentle joke, they walked so today's toddlers could run, usually straight toward electrical outlets. You wander back through that metaphorical nursery one last time. The fire crackles softly. The wallpaper peels a little, but the air is warm. There's a small wooden rocking horse in the corner, its paint flaking. You run your fingers over its mane. For a moment, you almost hear a child giggle, the past forgiving you for peeking. Historians still argue whether history itself can be healed. Maybe not, but it can be heard, and that's close enough. You step toward the door, leaving the room bathed in amber light. The world outside hums with the modern lullaby of refrigerators and distant traffic. Somewhere, a baby monitor glows faint green. A mother hums softly, not a hymn, not a command, just comfort. A father whispers goodnight, not because duty demands it, but because he wants to. And you? You have survived Victorian parenting, from its powdered milk to its moral lectures, and emerged blinking into a gentler age. You can still hear the echoes, but they no longer shout. They murmur like background static in a dream, fading with every breath. So, before you drift off completely, remember, history isn't meant to scare you from sleep. It's there to remind you that every generation builds its version of love, imperfectly, stubbornly, and sometimes painfully. What matters is that you keep rewriting it softer each time. Now, dim the lights just a little more. Let your breathing slow. Picture the gas lamps of London finally extinguished, one by one, until the whole city sighs. The cobblestones cool, the belts unbuckle, the factories quiet. The children of that century are asleep now, and so are their fears. You can join them. The story settles like dust after rain. The air grows still, sentences stretch, and the pace slows until even the ticking clock sounds like part of the rhythm. You've walked through a century's worth of noise, cane strikes, chimneys, prayers, and now there's only hush. Imagine you're standing at the edge of that long timeline, toes against the border where memory dissolves into dream. Behind you, the Victorians fade into watercolor, parents kneeling by candlelight, children clutching slates, all of them blurred by forgiveness. Ahead of you, a softer world glows, one that still falters, still frets, but tries. Your eyelids grow heavier with each word. The fan hums, a steady whisper of now. Every inhale feels cleaner, free of soot and sermon. Every exhale releases someone else's century. You don't have to fix the past tonight. You only have to rest in its lessons. The city outside your window is quiet, the kind of quiet Victorians never knew. Even the streetlights seem to pulse in time with your heartbeat. In this stillness, let gratitude replace judgment. Thank the generations who stumbled so we could walk gentler. Thank the children who endured and became ancestors of empathy. Thank yourself too for listening long enough to understand. And now, let the last of the story fade like lamplight on a wet cobblestone. The night folds around you, calm and complete. Sweet dreams.